Cavatelli is definitely the easiest pasta you can make at home, especially because it requires only 2 ingredients, water and semolina flour. I want to teach you how to make it, and I'm going to pair it with a fennel and pork ragu that is super fragrant, nice and sweet, and really, really delicious. It also is pretty customizable based on the vegetables that are in season, so it's going to work year-round. Here's how to make it. As promised, the pasta itself is made from just semolina and water. You could add salt if you want some extra credit, but it's not a requirement. We're gonna season the pasta water later. The ratio to make it is just 2 parts flour to 1 part warm water. The real tricky thing about this recipe is potentially finding semolina flour, as regular all-purpose flour doesn't work the same for this. So be sure to seek out semolina, that's what we want here. All you need to do is measure out 300 grams of semolina and add in 150 grams of hot tap water. Like I said, add a pinch of salt here if you want that extra, but it's not required. Mix this with your hands until the dough has come together and it's nice and smooth. It doesn't take too long, maybe just a few minutes of kneading should work. It's gonna look like this. Smooth and not crumbly is right where we want it to be. Once it's come together, tightly wrap the whole thing in plastic wrap and let it sit while we work on the sauce. This rest time is going to be important for the texture of the final cooked pasta. The sauce is a contrast of deep, rich pork, shallot, and fennel that's been cooked down for a while with the added levity of some nice crisp green veggies. It's ridiculously good. We're gonna need to peel and thinly slice 3 shallots. I know it sounds like a lot of onion for this, but it's pretty much gonna dissolve and create the body of the sauce along with the pork and the fennel. Shallots turn really nice and sweet when cooked like this, so it's gonna work beautifully with the pork. I don't cook with fennel all that often, but I think it's slowly becoming a favorite of mine. It's lightly sweet and a little licoricey without being overpowering. Trust me, I'm somebody who hates licorice. Like I really, really dislike that flavor, and I really enjoy fennel. So if you're somebody who thinks licorice and thinks really bad, trust me, it's gonna be delicious. Fennel's also a classic pairing with pork, so it's gonna work really, really well. Remove those top fronds. Those are those little green herby looking things. We're gonna use them as a garnish, and then slice the bulb in half and finally slice it from there, just like the shallot. With that prep done, we can head over to the stove to begin the first stage and the longest stage of the sauce. Get a Dutch oven heating over medium-high, and then add in a pound of ground pork. This is going to release a lot of fat, so there's really not much need for olive oil at this point. We're gonna judge that later. Add in a pinch of salt and begin breaking down the pork into smaller pieces with a wooden spoon. Over medium-high, this is gonna need around 5 minutes until you start to see some browning. For the sauce though, most of the browning is actually gonna take place later rather than right now. Deglaze the pan using white wine or a little white wine vinegar mixed with water. We'll need those scraped up bits for flavor as we continue cooking. Add in your shallot and fennel and mix it so that everything is nice and combined. We're gonna season this with a little more salt to draw out the moisture in the veg. And then what we're gonna do is lower the heat to medium-low and let this come up to a simmer. I know there isn't much liquid, but the shallots and fennel are gonna release some as we go. All you really need to be aware of is that you're gonna need to add a little bit of water, literally just like a splash every now and then, just to make sure you can continuously get the bottom cleaned and scraped up. Any burnt bits here are gonna ruin the deep, rich deliciousness that we're going for. We're gonna pop a lid on this to retain some of the moisture and let it cook for around 30 minutes. Every like 5 minutes or so, we're gonna wanna open it and stir it just to make sure that there's no burning. But the first stage of this cook is pretty much just to cook down the shallots and fennel. It's gonna start as this like gray mass of pork and veggies. As this cooks down, it's gonna turn into something really deep, caramelized, and delicious. It's honestly kind of a magic cooking process, and I wanna start utilizing this for more things. While this gently cooks down, we can prep the second part of the sauce and finish our cavatelli. This can pretty easily feel just like a big bowl of meat, so some spring veggies are gonna help nicely with that. Any crisp veg that looks good is gonna work perfectly. This could be zucchini, asparagus, some peas. I've got some snap peas here that are gonna be really nice. I'm just gonna remove the stringy back and cut them into a more bite-sized piece. Think about the shape of the pasta itself. Cavatelli is pretty small, and so you don't want massive lengths of vegetable that are gonna kind of outweigh each bite. This was close to about 200 grams of snap peas. Anything in that ballpark is gonna work really well for the amount of veggies you need for this. For the pasta itself, the dough has rested and the flour has fully hydrated, so we can roll and shape it. Remember making snakes with Play-Doh as a kid? Yeah, that's pretty much what we're doing here. Break your dough into a couple smaller pieces. I honestly just grab a tiny handful, but you could cut it into even fourths. Roll it into snakes, and then we can make the rolled hollow shape that defines cavatelli. There are really 2 ways to go here. One is easy and involves 0 special equipment, and the other is really fast but requires that you have one of these. This is a Cavatelli roller, and its job is to basically take that snake that we made and turn it into these perfectly textured shells. A friend of mine gave this one to me, but I bet you could find one online for like 20, 30 bucks or so. The other option is that once you've got it into a snake, you can take a bench scraper and cut them into little pieces. From there, you take each piece and pull it against the board using your dough scraper. What's gonna happen is the top of the dough scraper is gonna pull into this shape, and then it's gonna roll into a pretty nice rustic shell. It's classic and it's easy, but it does take a little bit longer. You could also do the rolling over the tines of a fork. So you'd basically, instead of pressing it against the board, you'd be pressing it against a fork. They make these specialized boards that give you a nice texture as well. But I wouldn't want to spend $10 on a board when I could just buy like a $30 Cavatelli roller. If you're gonna make these regularly and you want to spend money on a piece of equipment, I would say get that. All you really do is feed the snake in and turn the handle, and it just spits out tons of Cavatelli. Once they're spit out though, you want to be mindful of them sticking. So add a little bit of semolina flour to the actual machine itself and just sprinkle it over them as they come out in like 5 or 10 pieces. That way they don't stick together. It's pretty easy to get a big mass of stuck Cavatelli, and then that's not good for anybody. Do this over a tray and add a little bit of semolina to the bottom just so they don't stick together as well. These can sit while we finish the sauce and bring a pot of water to a boil. This easily makes enough for about 4 to 5 servings of pasta, so just adjust the amount of semolina to get the correct amount of pasta you need. Back at the sauce, most of that vegetable mass has cooked down, but it's still a little gray. Now we can turn up the temperature to medium and continue cooking while stirring up any brown bits that begin to form. This is gonna be basically another 30 minutes of cooking or so. We're gonna be constantly remixing any brown bits that form into the sauce until the whole pot is much browner and much more flavorful. It takes a minute, and you're gonna need to keep adding a little bit of water at a time just to make sure that you can scrape up everything. But this process is imperative for you to get a delicious sauce in the end. Depending on how fatty your pork is, you may need to add a little bit more olive oil as you go. Just judge it based on how it's cooking. If it's not really making too much noise and it just sounds like a boring pot, you're gonna wanna add a little bit of oil. If you can tell that it's sort of sizzling and browning is actually happening, you're good. I would say if your pork is anything less than 20% fat, you're definitely gonna need to add olive oil at this stage. So we're gonna continue cooking this and continue scraping until the pot is much browner and the whole thing is much more flavorful. At this point, once it's deeply browned, we can taste it to make sure it's correctly salted. Add some pepper along with some red pepper flakes and any salt as needed. This is gonna stay warm on the stove while we blanch our veggies and cook the pasta. Drop your sliced veggies into boiling salted water and cook them until they're just slightly tender but still crisp. If you go with something like zucchini, you can totally skip this step. For my snap peas in the pieces they were, that took about 3 minutes. Basically, I just test them and taste them, and if they feel tender, they're good. Remove them from the water and place them in an ice bath to stop the cooking process. Drop your Cavatelli into the boiling water and cook these for 2.5 minutes. As most fresh pastas go, these don't need much time to cook. However, they are gonna be a little bit more toothsome than your standard thin pasta. These are almost comparable to something like a gnocchi, but really not. They're sort of this in-between between like a standard extruded pasta and something a little bit thicker. They're super tasty. The texture, in my opinion, is a good thing in this case. Remove them from the water, but just make sure to reserve a little bit of pasta water so that we can cohesively mix everything in a minute. Toss the cooked Cavatelli into the warm ragu along with those blanched vegetables. Tossing and mixing is gonna make this thing a whole cohesive dish. If this looks a little dry as you're mixing, adjust the texture with olive oil and that reserved pasta water. I think I ended up using probably about 100 mils of that pasta water and just a little bit more olive oil. It's nice and tasty at the end here. Brings a little bit of like a fresh vegetal flavor to that richness from the pork. Taste this and adjust for seasoning again with salt, pepper, and red pepper flakes as needed to adjust salt levels and heat levels. Add in those reserved fennel fronds from earlier. Just make sure to wash and chop them first. I always tell you guys to taste your food as much as possible because you're gonna be the only ones that are able to adjust in the moment if it needs more salt or anything. Adjust it with salt and lemon juice, and then serve it with some grated pecorino and more pepper on top. Because of this whole process, Cavatelli has become one of my new favorite things to cook. The dough itself is super easy and really doesn't require any special equipment if you don't want to buy it. Just get a bench scraper, roll them out, and then you've got this delicious toothsome pasta that pairs well with anything from a red sauce to this delicious deep, rich pork ragu. The other thing that I want to do is make a ragu like this a lot more. The process of cooking down the shallot and fennel into something that is like sweet, fragrant, super nice, delicate, and rich at the same time is pretty fun and pretty delicious. It's worth that little bit of extra time that you take stirring at the stove for sure. Shout out to the amazing people supporting me directly on Patreon through patreon.com/CameronMarty. They get some cool benefits for supporting the channel, and I get to keep making videos like this. Consider becoming a patron, and if you're not up for that, consider subscribing to support the channel in that way. That means a lot to me as well. If you're in need of a breakfast recipe that's about as simple as these cavatelli, check out these homemade biscuits from Meg and Kay's grandmother, Mama. They're incredibly delicious and carry that old school tradition of pretty easy to make and pretty hard to master. Definitely worth checking out. Thank you so much for watching. Cheers.